Hello again. This is the second part of our uh, lecture, of the online lecture for History 103 for week 7. The first part there had to come to an abrupt halt because the battery was running out on my laptop. So I've talked about the Soviet Union, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany as kind of prominent anti-democratic challengers in the interwar period. And I argued for you that it was Nazi Germany that was really given the Nazi movement was given a new lease on life by the Great Depression. And something similar actually happens to Japan. Japan, which of course sort of is another one of the uh, anti-democratic voices in the 1920s and 30s. And by the time of the Depression, the Japanese government was, although it was theoretically a democracy headed by a parliamentary democracy headed by an emperor, the Japanese military was increasingly running the show. And the Depression hits Japan quite hard. Much of Japan's trade with Asia and the United States will wither away and will become much less significant, especially after 1930, because the American government is going to put a series of tariffs on Japanese products that is going to make trade between Japan and the United States much more costly. And this also causes inflation in Japan and also raises unemployment, not just U.S. policies, but the Depression in general. And for the Japanese government and the military that was increasingly calling the shots, foreign expansion seemed attractive because it seemed like it would create a self-sufficient economic bloc that wasn't, subject to tariffs, that would help make Japan secure. And this is really the impetus for Japan's heightened expansion into what is now China in Manchuria, up in the northeast. In September 1931, the Japanese army stages an explosion on a Japanese-operated railway line. The Japanese have been present increasingly in what is now Manchuria throughout the first part of the 20th century. Even though it wasn't formally a Japanese colony, there was a lot of Japanese influence here. But in 1931, the army basically stages this railway bombing as a pretext to pour thousands of Japanese troops into Manchuria, which will eventually become a puppet state part of the Japanese Empire called Manchukuo. This image, by the way, here is drawn from the very well-known comic strip, or the comic book character Tintin. This is from Tintin and the Blue Lotus, where he's witnessing the Japanese blowing up the railway line, and then he gets caught. That's not actually how it happened, although the Tintin is actually sort of a fairly savvy observer of world events, although he's also racist in a 1930s way, too. Here's perhaps a more conventional representation of Japanese troops coming into Manchuria in 1932. So Japan's influence in China is already building in the 1930s, explicitly with the invasion of Manchuria, and then more informally in other port cities too. By 1936, the Japanese government, we're not there yet. The Japanese government announced that it had a plan to really directly integrate the economies of Japan, Manchukuo in northern China, and other places in Southeast Asia. And it's from 1936 onward that Japanese colonial rule in Korea becomes much more invasive, policies requiring Koreans to take Japanese names and drafting men and women to go work in Japan in a variety of ways, mining, heavy industry, and then by the time we get to the Second World War, women being basically trafficked into prostitution as so-called comfort women. Okay, so that's the brief version of what's happening in Japan. Japan, a increasingly authoritarian government under the rule of the Japanese military, already expanding in China in the early 1930s in the north, and that's going to set up the outbreak of direct war in 1937 with the Chinese government, which by certainly from the mid-1920s onward is mostly under the control of the gentleman there in this image, Chiang Kai-shek, and his Harvard-educated wife, Madame Chiang. There's a lot one can say about China, but I'm not going to. The point here is that the old Qing dynasty was overthrown in 1911 by the Chinese Revolution under Sun Yat-sen, but by the 1920s had largely fallen under the control of a military strongman, in this case, Chiang Kai-shek. Something similar actually was happening in Turkey, by the way, under Kemal Ataturk. And I put those there as just a couple of other examples of anti-democratic voices around the world that have emerged by the early 1930s. You can, in fact, so tying all these together from the Soviet Union through Chiang Kai-shek, these were all anti-parliamentary regimes. That is to say, they were focused on increasingly on the rule of a leader. The Soviet Union doesn't quite work on this, but we'll just sort of pretend that it does. Certainly, it's the case for fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and in the case of Japan, at least, a group of leaders as opposed to one singular leader. But these are, hostile to the idea of democratic parliamentary government, and instead focused on the authoritarian rule of one leader or a small group of people. They ostensibly also were trying to promote some vision of a national community. Russia, the Soviet Union, is slightly different because it's a worker community. And to promote this national community, they all, to a certain degree, followed some degree of greater state intervention in the economy, whether it was regulations, whether it was tariffs, and pursued some sort of coherent social policies, social welfare policies, offering benefits, like in the case of Nazi Germany, to those who met the right political characteristics. Again, these guidelines don't necessarily apply to all the groups that I'm talking about here, because Chiang Kai-shek's China wasn't really effective enough at doing this kind of thing, but there was probably the ambition for it. And all of them embraced violence. All of them embraced sort of violent struggle, the idea of rebuilding society, again, in an explicitly anti-democratic way. There are also other points of comparison between them, but I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, so if the interwar period is marked by these increasingly anti-democratic challengers, it's also marked by an intensified anti-colonial movements around the world. There's dissatisfaction in the Middle East after the end of the First World War. There's ongoing unrest in various places in Africa and in Vietnam. Probably the most dramatic site of anti-colonial agitation, though, is in British India. As the slide said, it was dramatic, so it must be true. This is a map, by the way, of what India looks like under the British after World War I. You can see it includes what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, as well as parts of Burma, and little bits of Afghanistan. The war, there is already an anti-colonial movement, an independence movement in India before World War I, and it gets real amplification from the First World War because a lot of people in this movement think, well, Indian soldiers had died in service of the British Empire during the war, so when would concessions be forthcoming on the part of the British for greater autonomy or independence in India? And in fact, the British actually kind of cracked down after the war, and the galvanizing sort of embodiment of this is the massacre in Amritsar, which is up in the right in the sort of straight north, below on the map here. It's right below the frontier with what's marked as Kashmir, so that part that's dark at the top, right below that. Amritsar, which happens to be the holy city for Sikhism, one of the major religions of India. Anyway, in 1919, a peaceful gathering of a lot of Indians is broken up by force there is mostly Indian soldiers under British control, under British commander, who opened fire in this big square, and probably about 1,000 people are killed. And this sort of sparks enormous fury in India, and it catalyzes various resistance movements, particularly the so-called non-cooperation movement led by Mohandas Gandhi. Non-cooperation essentially being the idea, as articulated by Gandhi, that, and here's an image of Gandhi a little bit later on, that the Indian people should not be doing anything to sort of facilitate, to aid the administration of colonialism, of British colonial rule. There are two major non-cooperation campaigns. Probably the biggest one is the second one in March of 1930, where Gandhi quite famously marched with his followers to the sea, to boil salt water, which broke laws, British Indian laws, that made salt a government monopoly. He basically forced his own arrest and triggered a whole series of strike waves elsewhere in India. And again, the central idea here is that Gandhi is leading a movement that seeks to obtain independence for India, and Gandhi was sort of emphasizing, he wouldn't have necessarily have used non-violent resistance, but that's essentially what it translates to, the idea of using soul force to satyagraha in Sanskrit or Hindi, to resist the rules of a racist colonial state, and to not aid that colonial state at all in carrying out its work. In response to Gandhi, certainly he is periodically arrested, and his followers are too. The British try to make some concessions to try to increase Indian involvement in the running of empire, setting up elected legislatures in parts of India. This is really a concession to the pro-independence movement, although the British are certainly not willing to concede India its independence before the Second World War, as it turns out. By the end of the 1930s in India, too, I just want to point this out, there are growing divisions within the Indian nationalist movement between those who are sort of looking for an independent India, by definition sort of a Hindu one, and this specifically separatist Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah that argued that Muslims in India needed a separate homeland. We'll come back to that point when we deal with the wake of the Second World War. So India, I focus on here, and your book does too, is probably the most visible example of anti-colonial agitation in the 1920s and 30s. But there is agitation everywhere, and I think the point is essentially that the war, ironically, seems to strengthen the hand of the two major empire builders, France and Great Britain, but it also begins to embolden those forces, those groups in those colonies. And we saw this was the case with Kande Kamara, the way the veterans came back and became the backbone of nationalist movements in Africa. Right? So the war, ironically, emboldens those challengers to the global order even more. So, to tie that then to the broader picture, the end of the First World War seems to mean the triumph of liberal democracies like France, Britain, and the United States, oriented towards mass suffrage for all, but this moment of triumph is sort of short-lived because of the rise of authoritarian challengers or anti-democratic challengers, who nonetheless are also kind of trying to appeal to the masses in Italy, Germany, and Japan. And, of course, I've also pointed right now to currents of anti-colonial resistance that are much more developed by the end of the period. Okay, that's it for this week, for week 7. I hope that all made sense. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Enjoy.